All right, guys. So we're going to talk in this subsection more about kind of asylum seekers in the world today, refugees in the world today. Um, so refugees and asylum seekers, in many cases, are treated even worse than people who have been convicted of violent crimes, right? Um, Here in the United States, if an American citizen gets convicted of a violent crime, they go to prison. And in prison, they have a certain number of rights. They have a certain amount of geographic area that their cell has to occupy. They have to have a bed. They have to have the right to an appeal. They have to have, 3 square meals a day. They have to have blankets and pillows and toothpaste and showers and a certain amount of exercise time. Um, Whereas asylum seekers, those rights aren't respected in a lot of cases. I can't say they aren't given those rights because remember, human rights are inherent in humans. They're there because you're a person. They're not granted to you by a government. They can only be taken away by a government or not recognized by a government. Um, so these asylum seekers come into the United States or Germany or France or um, you know Japan or Australia or name a country. And in a lot of cases, their due process rights are ignored. They aren't given a hearing in front of a judge to tell the judge why they're seeking asylum. They don't get an appeal if they have a ruling against them. Um, they aren't allowed to post bail, um, and they're in a lot of cases they're put in overcrowded cells. They're not given a lot of kind of the basic amenities that humans deserve as humans. They're forced to sleep on concrete floors, no showers, no exercise time. Um, they're here in the United States. We're dealing with a situation as I record this where children are being separated from their parents. Um, so their rights as humans that we've talked about this entire semester are not being respected by their host countries. And the United States isn't the only one doing it. I'm not trying to pick on the United States. Australia is having a problem with this right now. Germany, other European countries are having a problem with this right now. The United States is not the only one in the world that's doing these, that's disrespecting human rights like this. But one of the things that makes it even more difficult on these people is that their host country requires them to have certain documentation. It could be birth certificate, could be documentation of, religious persecution or some other kind of thing to prove that they have a legitimate fear of returning home. But those very documents are incredibly hard to obtain when you're fleeing a country for your life. So a lot of times people are asked to provide evidence that they physically cannot access because it's either been blown up in a war or it's held by a government who wants to arrest them as soon as they get home, so they're not going to give up this documentation. It's very difficult to tell. It's very difficult to prove your claims, so you can prove that you have this fear of returning home and thus are entitled to asylum. It doesn't help that the media in a lot of these countries are portraying refugees as a problem. Okay, and this is very much tied up in race. In the 1940s, when the St. Louis came, or the 1930s, I should say, when the St. Louis came with all those Jewish refugees, lots of Americans wanted to reject those refugees because they thought Jews brought crime and corruption and all these horrible things with them, disease, and of course those weren't true, but people believed them, so we sent those people back to Europe to be slaughtered. Today, the media and some politicians portray immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers as a problem because of crime, because of disease, because of all these issues, and that's really not backed up by the data. Um, as a criminal justice professional, the research shows that immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, legal, illegal, any group of immigrants has a much lower crime rate than citizens do. So it's not that they're 100% perfect. There will be some people who come into a country and commit crime, but their odds of committing crime are much lower than the regular citizens of the country. They're being portrayed as bringing disease, but in fact, a lot of the people coming as refugees or asylum seekers have higher rates of vaccination and lower rates of communicable illness than the local population. So if anything, they would help stop spread disease. But people have a tendency to overlook that. They create what's called a moral panic. A moral panic is essentially when large groups of people get together and they start fearing irrationally things that are either not a threat or not the level of threat that they're treating it as, right? So in the 1980s, there was a moral panic about Dungeons and Dragons and how it was leading teenagers into Satanism. There have been moral panics about homosexuals. There have been moral panics about all kinds of things. But today, one of the bigger moral panics around the first world is a moral panic about refugees and immigrants, and how they're bad and they're other and they're somehow lesser than the people around you. There was a famous media personality who said something along the lines of, this isn't a direct quote, but something along the lines of, yes, these children are being treated horribly, but they're not our children. They're not American children, they're foreign children. As if that somehow justifies not respecting their human rights. But these pictures were all taken at assorted different countries, showing kind of the moral panic about refugees and asylum seekers. So that's a real issue in the world of human rights today. For the refugees themselves, it becomes extremely difficult not only to get to another country. I mean, that's hard enough, whether you're going over land or via airplane or via ship or whatever. It's really difficult to get into another country. But then even once you're there, it's difficult to get legal status. And even once you get legal status, it's difficult to kind of assimilate. You've got an entirely new culture most of the time, right? You don't know anything about how people live in this new place that you have to learn. Often there's a new language you have to learn. And then maybe the most difficult part is that work, a job, becomes extremely difficult to find. These people did something back in their home countries. They could have been a doctor or a lawyer or owned a business. They come here, and a lot of times the only jobs available to them are like manual labor or very simple, low-paying, low-status jobs. And that can be very difficult for people who, used to have these very high-status jobs like doctor or lawyer, and then they come and now they're a janitor or a road worker or, some other kind of low-status, low-pay worker. Because a lot of us put a lot of emphasis on what we do for a living as a definition of who we are. Like me, I'm a teacher. I don't know what I would be if I wasn't a teacher. I can't imagine not being a teacher. So if I had to flee to Canada, and the only job I could get was manual labor or cleaning or something, that would be very difficult for me because, you know, I have this internal idea that Kevin's a teacher. So if I can't teach, what am I? So that can be it's a very difficult process at every stage, for people fleeing these situations. So we've talked a little bit about this before, but we're going to go over it again. So borders, international borders, are an abstract concept, right? There is no line marked down in the ground, prior to us getting here and saying, okay, this is going to be the United States, or this is going to be Germany, or this is going to be, you know, whatever country you want to talk about. Those lines are fluid and they're essentially arbitrary. So this guy, Gary Davis, in 1948, he decides that, look, this is a problem. People need to be able to travel. People need to be able to seek a life where they can have the most successful life. People need to be able to be a refugee, seek asylum, travel the world and learn. So he was an American who flew to Paris and formally gave up his U.S. citizenship. He renounced his citizenship, got rid of it, and then essentially declared himself a citizen of the world, i.e. a citizen of all countries and no country, and started making these world passports. And these world passports, his organization has tried to give to people who need them. People who need to go to other countries, either as refugees or asylum seekers or whatever. And he's had a large amount of success. There are 6 countries that legally will accept these world government passports. They're all fairly small countries. No like major industrialized nations recognize these passports legally. But 152 different governments, which includes most of the first world, have recognized them on kind of a convenience basis, right? So we want to accept you. You have this world passport. We want you to come here. We'll go ahead and wink, wink, nudge, nudge, put a stamp on the passport and let you in, right? So according to the law, they're not valid, but they're treated as if they're valid in certain situations by these 152 different countries. Does that make sense? Okay. That's the end of our section on refugees. Thank you, guys.